Welcome to Walking Radio, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the voices of people on the front lines, those most affected by decisions made far from their lived realities. This is a space where lived experience takes center stage, where stories are shared on their own terms, and where conversation moves, sometimes literally walking and talking. For the foreseeable future, Walking Radio will focus on the closures of supervised consumption and harm reduction sites across Ontario. These spaces save lives. Their loss will be felt hardest by the most vulnerable among us, people who are our friends, our neighbors, our loved ones. Through interviews that are trauma-informed and rooted in full consent, we'll hear from workers, healthcare professionals, and people whose lives hang in the balance. In this episode, we walk with Lee, a nurse whose background spans social work, psychotherapy, intensive care, as well as mental health and substance use programs. I was honored to share a walk with Lee on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, April 13th, 2025. We met up at the intersection of Yonge and Eglinton in Midtown Toronto, and then strolled together through the nature trails and surrounding neighborhood of Sherwood Park. This episode offers a record of our time together and the space we held in a moment of historical importance. Let's walk together and see what pathways to better understanding we find along the way. I'm Patrick Corvin, and this is Walking Radio.
Don't wreck that. That's a lot of money, I'm sure. Oh my gosh.
So wonderful. So here we are at the beautiful Sherwood Park.
Yeah, I've never been here before. I don't think, anyway.
So however you'd like to introduce yourself, I invite you to. How's it going?
So my name is Lee. I work in an acute care setting in which I have responsibilities in both mental health and substance use programs. But I've also been an ICU nurse. I've worked in other milieus also, and I also have a social work license that is in inactive status now, but previously performed counseling and psychotherapy in Northern Ontario.
Amazing. Well, it is such an honor to be walking with you on this gorgeous day.
It's beautiful.
In Sherwood Park in the Yonge and Eglinton neighborhood in Toronto. So maybe, do you want to talk a little bit about your connection to harm reduction, supervised consumption?
Sure. So I came from Northern Ontario, where we have access issues, and not just Northern Ontario, like a big city, but like far removed from the big city, Northern Ontario. So there's access issues in general to all healthcare services, let alone related to substance use, harm reduction, and treatment services, right? And so I worked up there for quite a few years and then went back to school for nursing. At that time, we were talking about like harm reduction more in the realms of like, persons who were cutting. We talked about tips for people that had inhalation. So there was at that time in Thunder Bay, a population, we were seeing an increase in statistics for persons with hepatitis, and a part of it had to do with glass implements when people were smoking and passing. And so I remember, like, we were doing needle exchange programs and things like that back then, but the tips for pipes was like kind of new, and there was this huge community outrage that happened at that time. And I remember thinking, like, this is a piece of healthcare. Like, it's on the spectrum of healthcare. Why would we not do this? It makes great sense. It keeps people safer. And so then I went to nursing school, and I ended up in the ICU actually for a long time. And now I'm back in the the mental health and substance use milieu, and I kind of am at a higher level, but we do a lot of like advocacy. We have a lot of clients in our services that use substances, and for them to be able to continue to partake in our services, harm reduction is so crucial because it's, again, on a spectrum from, no substance use to death, really, essentially, is the spectrum that exists.
Yeah, which I think we're about 2 weeks in now since the closures, even though we had that injunction, that glimmer of hope.
Yeah,
so
it's such a confusing time.
Yeah, it is very confusing.
Yeah.
The last episode that I did, we ended on we can go whichever way you want.
Doesn't matter.
This way is good.
Sure.
It ended with this glimmer of hope with the injunction because the neighborhood group in Toronto had gone through the court system and challenged the closures.
Yeah.
And the decision was made to implement the injunction against the closures, but in practical terms, they still closed with, I think, one exception, which was the neighborhood group.
Yeah.
But like you said, it's very confusing, and I'm not even sure if that's entirely accurate, but I do know because of the way the funding worked and how the Ministry of Health has tied funding to the agreement not to offer supervised consumption or harm reduction, that because so many of the sites had already signed on, essentially because they had no other choice but to go to the heart
hubs
model, that they had to close supervised consumption anyways.
Yeah. And it's confusing for all of us care providers across the province because what's happening in one area may not be happening in another.
Mm-hmm.
So we know Northern Ontario had closures or are slated for closures. I'm not sure where they're at right now. But that's like all of Northwestern Ontario that's affected. Like that's a huge geographic area.
Because was it just Thunder Bay?
Yeah, I believe so.
That had the site?
So then in other areas, they're staying open, but I know that there's issues now opening the heart hubs because from what I understand, and I'm not involved with the heart hubs, is that there's funding that's tied between supervised consumption and heart hubs.
Yeah, and what I mistakenly assumed for months before the switchover was that there would be a overlap, or at least like the same day supervised consumption closed, that the heart hubs would open, but that has not been the case, is my understanding. So now there's just this massive gap with no service. So exactly what is happening on the ground right now and in the lives of people who use substances, it's a real mystery.
Well, and if it's confusing for service providers, it's going to be even more confusing for everyone, right?
Yeah.
And for the people that are advocating, we can't advocate if we don't know what's actually happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. And that's a real struggle also.
Yeah, and it's never been clear to me exactly what these heart hubs are supposed to actually look and feel like.
So from what I understand, and I've seen some proposals, it's different everywhere. So you can very much individualize it to your personal area, like to your client population, to your area. And so that also can be kind of, I'm sure, confusing to people because some of our population travels quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so to know what services look like in one place and know that they may not look the same somewhere else when you access them, that could be challenging also, right?
Yeah, and so I'm not sure if that includes like involuntary treatment.
So, as of right now, sorry, for heart hubs?
Yeah, for heart hubs.
It's community-based.
Community-based, okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot of like community agencies in my area that have kind of come together to try and offer as fulsome of a service as possible. And we're very fortunate that in our area, as of right now, our SCS is not slated to close. Mm-hmm. But with that being, and it's going to live down the street from the Heart Hub, which would be very cool because we don't disagree that we need more treatment in the province of Ontario. And there's a lot of really amazing reports that show that we're missing a lot of vulnerable populations, including teens and young adults, women with children, etc. So we need that. And I don't think any of us argue against heart hubs when we're working with people who use substances. And we also know that we need supervised consumption sites, because if you don't have those, people die.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such an important point, because it is really easy for this to fall into an adversarial type of concept or dichotomous relationship. But really, the concept of a heart hub is something that I've heard people in the field begging for decades.
100%. And we know that
just not at the expense of the supervised consumption.
100%. And we know how long has it been since the 70s that we've been talking about social determinants of health. We know that housing increases people's quality of life, their health, their well-being, so much more.
Yeah.
And so to tie housing together with substance use can be a little bit problematic.
Right.
Because they're not married together at all times. However, at the same time, having these services are so crucial.
Yeah, and I think you're kind of alluding to the housing first model, which replaces the concept of previous times that first people had to get quote unquote clean, which is not really a term we use.
Correct.
But that they would have to have a period of abstinence before they're eligible for housing. And that model has since been discredited a long time ago. But so now we have the housing first model. But I often say housing first is an awesome concept, but first we need housing.
Yeah, agreed.
So we are still in this limbo where it's just a lack of affordable housing is horribly exacerbating conditions, I think, for people who are living on the streets and living with substance use challenges.
But also by tying together housing and substance use, yes, there's a place to tie them together, but by doing only that, we're excluding people who use substances who are housed. Mm-hmm. And so if we're kind of leaving them out of service, we know that eventually, unless they have the socioeconomic ability to hide their substance use issues or afford to keep going to treatments or afford to keep their house, or their families step in and really parentalize them, I guess is kind of what happens, that these folks will eventually become very vulnerable too, and will end up on the streets also. So we're not really taking that preventative full scope approach that we really could.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to talk about the grief and bereavement side of things?
Yeah, I think that one of the big challenges, and not just grief and bereavement, but in general, is when I was seeing clients who had substance use issues or even behavioral addictions also. It's not cut and dry, and that's, I think, the hard part for people to understand that haven't lived in this world or worked in this world, is that there's a lot of misconception that there's a moralistic explanation for behavior, and that if you could just pull up your bootstraps and cope, you'd be okay.
Yeah.
But people don't understand that it's health issues that have affected this population. So historically, some of the causes for people to get into substance use issues have been around, increases in medication to help control pain, without the understanding of where the ceilings lay around there. It has been also, yes, of course, mental health issues. It has also been trauma issues. And it has also been grief and loss. And grief and loss is so pervasive and so under-recognized by service providers and by persons who are struggling in general. And grief and loss is not just, and I've heard this story a million times, somebody was using with somebody and then they, kind of came to from whatever substance they were on, and they found the person that they were using with beside them dead. So it's not just that, it's also loss of identity, which is huge. Who are you? Because you don't wake up one morning and go, hey, I've got a really great idea. I'm going to become a person that uses substances. It never, ever, ever happens that way. It's this slow unraveling of behavior and of circumstance and of stigma that contributes to where you end up.
And I think with that, a loss of sense of self-worth, which
Absolutely.
gets reinforced by what society reflects back on you with the stigma.
100%. You know, it's a loss of family who, you know, doesn't understand how you ended up here, why you ended up here. You know, there's been cutting of ties because of self-stigmatization. It's a loss of a profession, a career, a job. Because, you know, if you have legal issues now related to your substance use, you may not be able to go back to that profession.
Right, yeah.
You know, it's a loss of so much more than just people who have passed away. You know, a childhood house, you know, childhood friends, you know, your future and what you planned for yourself. All of that goes away. And you have to mourn those losses or deal with those losses. And it's so intertwined.
Yeah. So do you think I know substance use is very multifaceted and multifunctional in a way. But do you think one of those functions is to kind of escape the depths of the reality of those losses and that grief?
I mean, it's possible, but really when you're looking at reasons why people continue to use, it's not just, you know, untreated mental health disorders. It's not just grief, bereavement, trauma, and masking that. It's not, you know, some people would say chasing a high, which that term really bothers me for a lot of reasons, but that's what colloquially, it's known as. Really, because of all of the horrible feelings that you get during withdrawal, you're continuing to use substances just to stay well. And I think we've all experienced this potentially in some other area of our life. And we were kind of alluding to this before, you know, caffeine use, cigarettes, online gambling, or shopping, or, you know, all of these coping mechanisms that we have are things that we do. Even your mobile phone, if I took that away from you and said you couldn't have that back for a week, you know, there'd be like that patting of your body to find out where it is because you'd, oh no, I think I lost it. Your family might be phoning around to find out if you're okay. You know, you might be having some anxiety around what you're missing out in the world. Maybe that's how your friends socialize or your work comes together. So I think we can all use something in our lives that's socially acceptable, affordable, etc. To empathize with persons that use substances and understand that withdrawal that's why people continue to keep using. It's just to stay well.
Yeah. I can think of many so-called upstanding citizens who, if you threatened to take their morning Timmies away, you would have a very serious problem on your hands.
For sure.
And well, I remember Gabor Mate talking about how really everybody has some kind of addiction, whether it's not necessarily substance use, but some kind of addictive behavior.
Yeah.
It's very pervasive.
Yeah. But we don't recognize it as that. Because again, it's socially acceptable. We can afford it. It doesn't impede in our lives, quote, quote, although it could, and we don't recognize that either, right? Like, you know, all of our friends do it. All those things.
Yeah. When you take it a step further, think of alcohol. We talked about that on this podcast before. I mean, that is a substance that is so central to our culture and society and so generally accepted, but carries really like significant harms alongside it with motor vehicle accidents and health outcomes.
I mean, it just got relabeled as a carcinogen, right?
Yeah. And it's been recently said that there is no safe usage.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of recently there was a shooting at a bar in Scarborough where I think like a dozen people were injured.
Oh.
And I thought of the parallel with the supervised consumption site where
You got only 20 minutes to do the test?
that was used as the justification for closing all of the sites
Yeah.
where there was that shooting and someone was
Yeah.
fatally injured. When you compare that to this shooting in Scarborough at a bar, there was no sudden outcry that we need to close all of the bars and all the restaurants that serve alcohol. I mean, that would be absurd.
And that is a supervised consumption
It is a
site
supervised
because we have smart
it's a-
servers.
It's a for-profit, privatized, supervised consumption
Right.
site.
Because
There's hundreds of them.
they X your hands if you're over your limit. They
Right.
take your car keys.
Yeah.
It's totally a harm reduction model. And yeah, absolutely.
That's right. Yeah, there's real consequences for people if they overserve.
Yep.
They have legal and professional obligations towards people they serve.
But also, you can actually buy your substance of choice there, where you
And
can't.
they
You
sell it
can't
there.
at a supervised
Yeah.
consumption site.
That's another
Yeah.
massive distinction is supervised consumption sites don't, I mean, first of all, they're not for profit.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no one's selling fentanyl there to
Yeah.
service users.
No, for sure. But I think the other thing that's also maybe missed or that we don't know is that a lot of these supervised consumption sites go beyond just helping the person at the door. They also do a lot of substance testing. And that's so critical for me and my job to be able to tell providers, hey guys, like could be coming into the EDs. How do we deal with this? Or, hey, my people who are using substances, I want you to be aware and be safer. Actually, when you're using substances, because you think that you're getting fentanyl and you're not getting fentanyl anymore, you know?
Yeah, in a huge portion of the samples, there's now benzodiazepines, which in my recollection, this is kind of anecdotal, but I remember that really coming in with the beginning of the pandemic when a lot of the supply chains, just as with like consumer goods, but also with the illicit drug trade, there's restrictions in the supplies of fentanyl that getting in. And so I think that was around the time where we started to see a lot of new additives like benzodiazepines coming in. And now we have xylazine.
Methamphetamine.
Yeah, so you've got
Yeah.
people like, so now it's like a really augmented situation where people are now becoming like physically dependent on opioids, but also on benzodiazepines and whatever else is being cut into the supply.
Well, and in terms of how to undo that, when people come into the ED, we know that Narcan is the remedy for opioids, right? Or is the antidote. And we know that flumazenil
Yes.
we can give for benzos,
Yeah.
but we can't give that in the community. It's not a zero risk drug. It carries
Yeah.
with it innate risks and has to be given IV. So things like seizures
Yes.
is a risk, right? But
Yeah.
when it comes to xylazine and methamphetamine, which are now co-contaminating at really high rates, the only thing we have is supportive care.
Yeah.
And I need to know that to treat people's health in such a critical way when they're walking into an ER door
Right.
or not walking in, really, as the case, right? And then also around like these talks around safer supply and what we can do to keep people more healthy and safer. If we were to do a safer supply with an opioid, it's really important to know that that person, if they're go back to using from a street substance, they could be benzodiazepine naive now.
Yeah.
And when they take that illicit supply, they've now been exposed or overexposed to benzos potentially also, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, which has ramifications for people with seizure disorders.
Well, and even just because the side effects look the same, right?
Yeah.
So opioids pinpoint pupils, decreased level of consciousness, decreased respiration rate. Benzodiazepines, decreased level of consciousness, decreased respiration rate.
Yeah.
Xylazine and methamphetamine, decreased respiration rate and decreased level of consciousness.
Yeah.
I need my staff to be aware of that.
Yeah. I've had people who are just out cold for like 5 hours at a time
Yeah.
where like we Narcan them.
Yeah.
It takes care of the fentanyl
Yep.
pretty fast, but then they've got this significant amount of benzos or what other
Yeah.
tranquilizers or sedatives in the supply. And then they're just out,
Yeah.
completely unconscious for hours. And have no recollection.
Yeah.
Which I think is a great segue into safer supply, which is seems to be being used as a political, I don't know if you call it dog whistle. I think it's a bit of a red herring. Do you want to talk about the role of safer supply?
I can. I think in general, all of this is really political though right now. I mean, we've been in an election cycle. We're going into an election cycle.
Yeah.
And so it is a point of contention.
Yeah.
We also had our mayors.
So why not blame the most marginalized
Right.
people, for the most
Right.
powerless people for all of our society's ills?
Well, and we also had 19 mayors sign a letter
Yeah.
to the province to support the idea of using the legal system essentially to force people into treatment, rather than take care of basic needs, health needs, etc.
Yeah, criminalize poverty, essentially.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, safer supply is on that spectrum of stuff that's going to get thrown into the arguments of NIMBYism and greater societal concern,
Yeah.
and I'm using air
Yeah.
quotes with that.
Enabling
Yeah.
is always
Yes.
that.
Yeah.
That always gets trotted out. No matter
Yeah.
how much we counter-argue, there's always this pervasive sense that,
Well, and in
based
BC, it's even further. It's killing children, right?
uh-huh,
Because there's been 2 legal cases now brought forward
oh,
about young people who had their hands on safer supply.
right.
So, yeah.
What topic shall we wander into next?
Oh, good question.
Well, maybe we can go to Roan sent this text, Roan from episode 2.
Yeah.
And feel free to interpret this however you want, or
Sure.
just as a launching point.
Yeah.
So Roan asked, the intersection of physical health and addiction is often under-discussed compared to that of mental health.
100%.
Mental health plays a key role in all of our lives, regardless of any substance history. How would you explain the effects of walking through a world where people aren't ready to have these discussions until recovery, and the effects of closures on this large population?
So, I'm not sure that I completely understand the question,
Yeah,
but I
there's a
think
lot
some
there.
of the crux of what they're getting to is that people have legitimate health concerns that go and get kind of sloughed off and put in the category of, well, you use substances or, well, you have a mental health issue, rather than actually investigating and treating the physical health issue. And we know this happens a lot. We've heard so many stories when you work in healthcare of somebody that's come into the ER with some kind of an issue. They say, oh, they just need to get clean, quote, quote, or sober, quote, quote. Discharge them, and their actual issue was something medical,
Yeah.
But also, I can't imagine how invalidating that is not to be seen and heard in that situation also, right?
Yeah.
There are some other populations, unfortunately, that this happens quite a bit with. One of the examples that I can think of is persons who are considered overweight. Often it's just lose weight and you'll be fine.
Right.
That's not fair or right either.
No.
So it's a stigma, again, really. It's a cycle of stigma, right?
Yeah.
But the other thing I think that's important is that we don't treat any other health population the same way as we treat persons who use substances or persons with mental health issues, or in that we were just discussing this a little while ago, if you come into the hospital and you have an angio because you have a heart issue, and then you celebrate with McDonald's, which I've actually had happen in real life, we don't go, oh, we're not going to give you any care. And as you said, we also don't go, oh, we're actually going to force you into treatment.
Yeah, we're going to lock you to a bed if
Yeah.
you even look at that Happy Meal.
Yeah. And then release you back out into a world where Happy Meals are everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Which was very valid also.
Yeah.
People that come in who have anxiety, we treat for healthcare. we check their hearts, and then hopefully we're checking their hearts, and then we send them into, the mental health system if that's what needs to happen. But I can appreciate that, pain is a good reason why people end up using substances over the long term.
Yeah,
there's
a lot with Roan's experience. Had to do with physical pain.
And I've had a lot of clients that started off with physical pain issues, with injuries on the job, and they've gotten prescribed meds, and maybe they don't have healthcare coverage, or maybe they can't take time off work, or maybe they're seasonal employees and they have to go back, and they go back to work and they get re-injured or they exacerbate that injury, then their medication increases, then they have to quote supplement, end quote, because the doctors aren't increasing their prescriptions, but they have to continue working for a lot of really great reasons. And then they end up in trouble.
Yeah. I think one population that we don't really talk about a whole lot outside of the insider circles is like construction workers, people
100%.
in the trades.
I talk about this all the time,
Yeah.
Because that's a part of why the Occupational Health and Safety Act changed. I think it was the end of 2023, early 2024, around having to have Narcan on site and somebody trained to give Narcan, because construction workers are the highest risk for toxic supply and overdose on the job.
Right. If your livelihood depends on your ability to perform manual tasks physically for hours and days on end.
Yep.
What do you do when that's jeopardized by chronic pain?
Right.
And that's not properly managed.
Yep. So you previously worked at...
Yes.
What was your experience of that population? Because we both know that it's all walks of life that end up through our doors, right?
It really is, yeah. Where I worked, I would say by far the majority of our clients were street involved or homeless.
Yeah.
But we did have people with jobs, with housing, who worked in construction or worked odd jobs and were dealing with chronic pain.
Yeah.
And would come to inject either fentanyl. In rare cases, some people, this is virtually unheard of now, but because heroin is nowhere to be found anymore. And it's almost like a wistful nostalgia for heroin where...
But that was the pattern, right? It started with prescribed opioids and then heroin, and now look where we're at with fentanyl. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like there's a lot of different pathways, because there is that, like what you're talking about with the large pharmaceutical companies pushing prescription opioids for a long time, and that fueling like one arm of the opioid crisis.
Sure.
But then I also feel like I had a lot of clients who just kind of went straight into it, like through street life.
Yeah.
The roughness, the chaos, the trauma.
Yeah.
The like self-soothing.
Yeah.
Just introduced to fentanyl directly. Or once the heroin supply dried up around, I think it was maybe around 2016, 2017.
Yeah.
That's when you started to see warnings about this quote-unquote purple heroin that was causing a lot of overdoses. And then that purple heroin turned out to be fentanyl and replaced the entire heroin supply.
Yeah.
And with fentanyl you get, it's much, much more powerful than heroin. But the peak is, the peak is much higher and the drop-off is much quicker.
Yeah.
So the duration is much, much shorter, which when people become physiologically dependent upon it, it creates this treadmill where they start to go into withdrawal very quickly within a couple of hours. And so it's just this constant chase. Whereas with heroin, you'd have a much longer duration, so it would keep people level for longer.
Yeah. And I think the other group that really gets not recognized, and you kind of alluded to it when you're talking about the people that came into your services, is like, at least people are coming into your services. It's more that like middle group of people that are like, I'm struggling with my substance use, but I'm not bad enough, and again, air quotes.
Yeah.
But I'm not, out of the woods or not concerned about my substance use. Where do I go? And there's nothing for them.
Right. There's NA.
Yeah, or AA, or there's the A's. But even there's some stigma around.
Yeah.
Sometimes around folks that are not in the throes.
Yeah.
Quote, quote again.
Right.
And are using those services.
Yeah.
They're in the danger zone, but they've not crossed over yet. Mm-hmm. They recognize that they've got some problematic behavior, but they're not, it's problematic only.
Yeah.
Yeah. And where do they go? And I think that's another, struggle with the heart hubs is, it's targeting the most vulnerable persons perhaps, but it's also not targeting up the pipeline from those most vulnerable folks, and eventually they will come down and be the next group of folks that are struggling.
Yeah. I've been thinking just earlier today about the concept of downloading responsibility of, when it comes to housing, substance use.
Yeah.
We saw was it 10 or 15 years ago, downloading of responsibility for housing, like social housing, onto municipalities.
Yeah.
And it feels like that's part of an overall trend. And when it comes to substance use too, is like downloading responsibility for treatment onto like NA, AA, these volunteer groups led by non-experts. And they do offer a lot of people that community and sense of belonging, and they do help some people, but it strikes me as a very vulnerable, precarious approach.
And I think the other thing that people take for granted is when I lived up north, prior to COVID, prior to the internet being very pervasive, for me to access AA, it's supposed to be confidential, but we live in small communities.
Yeah.
And so, you have to be really brave to walk through that door. Whereas in a big city, I may have the ability to access a different meeting that's not in where people know where I am. Mm-hmm. Up north, that wasn't an option. If you wanted to access those services, chances are high you're walking through the door and everybody knows you. And they may or may not know that you're struggling.
Yeah. And they may or may not know your parents.
Yeah, 100%. But that goes for pharmacies too, right? So this is the other piece up north, is like if I'm a teenager or a young adult and I want to access methadone, I have to go into a pharmacy during school hours.
Right.
See a pharmacist who probably knows my family.
Yeah.
See all the other people in the pharmacy who know that I'm getting a drink. That's very stigmatizing.
Yeah.
And then get back to school.
Right.
Right?
It's crazy.
And this is the thing. So there's a report released just after COVID talking about teens and young adults. And when you're looking at uptake of OAT, you saw this group of adults who went off methadone and switched over to Suboxone because it was just more in fitting with their life.
Yeah.
Maybe?
So OAT stands for opioid agonist treatment?
Therapy treatment, you saw this group of adults who switched from methadone to Suboxone. But when you look at teens and young adults, the Ontario report shows that they actually just went off of everything.
Oh, really?
They didn't have that switch over. They disappeared. And they weren't being asked about substance use in the ERs when they were presenting, and most of them did present to a healthcare provider prior to experiencing a toxicity. And so, I think we all, it's so stigmatizing to think that only certain populations are struggling, and we need to ask everybody. That needs to be a standard of care, in general.
Yeah, and how do you encourage people to be forthcoming about their substance use when there's so much stigma around it?
And again, that gets to practitioner education, right? I talk with my staff all the time. What does nursing school or social work school or whatever school you go to teach you? Do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you use drugs? That's very judgy.
Yeah.
Right?
Very,
so
yeah.
we need to change our language a lot around that. One of the questions that I give as an example is, when you use alcohol, do you have a glass of wine with dinner, 12 pack on a Friday, or a 40 on the weekend?
Mm-hmm.
So when you use alcohol, it seems everybody uses alcohol.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have people be like, no, dear, I don't use alcohol. I've never gotten like people angry at me because they don't use, but I've opened a door and said that I'm a safe person.
Yeah.
Then when I say a glass of wine with dinner, all those nonas that have had a glass of wine with dinner since they were wee peas
Right.
will remember. And that's really important in the medical world, because if they have any liver or renal issues or they're taking certain medications, we want them to remember that that's actually alcohol when it's become so normalized that they may not recognize it as such.
Right.
And when I say a 40 on the weekend, I've now opened the door and said, I've heard this before. I'm not going to judge you. I'm a safe person for you to have this conversation with. And I have had clients be way more open about their substance use because of the framing of the question, going from do you and like shaking your finger kind of
Yeah.
to like when you, what does it look like? Tell me.
Yeah,
And having that like curiosity rather than,
yes, the interrogation.
yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible how just subtle changes in language can really reframe the situation and lead. It's like choosing a slightly different path,
Yeah,
and then can lead to just such vastly different outcomes.
absolutely. And also setting up that safety, right? People have to feel safe to disclose, to talk about, to ask for help, for information, for harm reduction, for whatever. And I think that's the other piece of supervised consumption sites that gets overlooked, is that when people return to the same site over and over again, they continue to see familiar faces like yourself, who creates relationships.
Yes.
And then when the time comes, or when there's concerns or other things that are going on, be them health, physical, mental health, social, whatever, they are more likely to disclose that to you because you have a safe, trusting relationship with them.
Yeah, that reminds me of that beautiful saying they keep returning to, is the opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection.
Yeah.
I see
100%.
that over and over and over in our line of work.
Yeah.
Those connections, like they serve over the long haul. I think what gets missed in these reactive policy decisions is that somehow these intransigent issues that are so deeply entrenched in people's lives, that somehow they can just be reversed overnight.
Yeah.
Like someone who has been struggling with homelessness and maybe mental health issues or physical pain for years or decades, that somehow we can just sprinkle some pixie dust or like say the serenity prayer or something, and then that person's just going to snap out of it.
Yeah.
It's a complex issue.
But I also think the other piece that's missed is that the relationship is bi-directional. Like, it's not just the relationship I have with my client that gives them a safe space and hopefully moves them to wherever they need to move. And sometimes my patients or my clients would come into me with a non-substance related issue, have a substance issue, but like we need to work on that, relationship with your kids or your partner or your work or whatever. We don't necessarily need to deal with the substance use issue. We need to deal with what's in front of you. What's your problem? What's your biggest concern?
Yeah.
But it's not just that one way. It goes both ways. Like, I don't know about you. I know that I've had people that have come into my office, my practice, my hospital, that have just left their mark on me and really, right?
Yeah.
Right? And I think that gets really glossed over too when it's like, oh, all you guys do is, put them through the system and pump them in and out, right? Or all you do is Narcan the same person over and over again, which I hear all the time.
Right.
But it's not about that. It's about not just creating a relationship with that person, but how you were impacted when you have to Narcan that person over and
Oh
over
my gosh,
again,
yeah.
right?
there are very few times for me. I mean, not many people go through the experience of pulling someone out of the jaws of death.
Yeah.
And that being your job.
Yeah.
But I've done it so many times, and I don't, like, there's so few times where I was like not holding back tears after. It's such an intense thing for everybody. Intense for the person who has come out of the overdose, intense for the responders.
Yeah. And I think that's also possibly a big difference between milieus too, right? Like, I've worked in the ICU, I've done code teams, but I may or may not have a relationship with that person. And that relationship may or may not be long-term, stable, impactful, like it is for you folks working at SCSs, where you see the same people over and over again, over time.
Yeah.
You know their stories, you know their personal stuff. You know them as people, not as, a person that uses substances, a person with lived experience, to enter a terrible A word here.
Yeah.
You know them as people. And so that impacts you too.
Oh, yeah.
And that's not
the other
talked about.
clients. Yeah.
100%, yeah. And the other clients, 100%.
Just yeah, I keep saying, like, I don't work in the SCSs now.
Yeah.
But I keep saying, like, of course, there's never been a single death in a SCS. No one's ever died under our watch. But they're not open 24 hours a day.
Yep.
And people also use off-site.
Yep.
So we're all, like, staff and clients alike, deeply impacted by death and loss.
Right. How many times have you opened the newspaper and you've seen,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we hear through our networks
Absolutely.
who's died.
Yeah.
And I keep saying it's like a level of loss and fatality it strikes me that it's just impossible to process that in a lifetime fully. I would often compartmentalize it, because you really have to compartmentalize it somehow to keep doing your job.
So now that you're out, how are you dealing with it?
I guess this podcast is a big part of it. But prior to that, I would often just try to trick my brain into thinking that person's just, like, they've moved to another town, or they're just not using the site right now.
Yeah. And was there support for you guys? Like, I know in hospital, we've built, especially since COVID, we know that practitioners have experienced more levels of trauma. We've had more increased responses for staff. So things like social workers on site, or increased EAP programs, or increased access to psychotherapists, or increased, there's Code Violet now, which is like a mental health response within hospitals.
Oh, wow.
So that's in hospitals, very different milieu than community. What was offered for you guys, if anything?
Oh, well, it was an interesting overlap with like folks who specialized in bereavement during the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
There's so much overlap between these two.
There is so much overlap, you're right. Even for clients that have experienced grief and loss,
who have
that's
both.
where the gap's getting filled. It's not getting filled by hospices or traditional grief groups. Absolutely.
Yeah, so they were an incredible support. And just like spending time with colleagues outside of work.
Yeah.
But there's no question it took a toll on me.
100%.
Like I burned up.
Yeah, peer support networks are important, but that doesn't, like, we're all in our trauma together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was during the pandemic as well, and I was in nursing school. And
Oh yeah.
all those things piled on top of each other. And
Yeah.
I had a couple of brushes with violence, and
Yeah.
I just couldn't do it anymore.
Yeah. So do you feel like that stuff's still on a shelf for you, or can you pull it down sometimes and unpack it and put it back?
I think I'm continuously processing it.
Yeah.
And this podcast is a big part of that as well. So I'm feeling like I'm still contributing. And I work in HIV care now.
Yeah.
And I see a lot of the same clients.
Yeah.
And former colleagues. So that's really very precious to me to continue with those relationships.
So for you, given your experience working directly with persons that use substances in this kind of care, experiencing that like transference, counter-transfer situation,
Right.
what would you say to the politicians, given that they are just existing at this very like theoretical policy level and not actually in it?
Yeah.
Or they're looking at these folks as votes, right? NIMBY, not in my backyard. And if I get them off the streets and hide them away somewhere, then I'm going to get more votes from the voting base.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Well, what I did say to the politicians, to Doug Ford and Sylvia Jones, as soon as they announced this, I wrote a letter. I know letter writing has sometimes minimal to no impact, but I think it's still it's still very important.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between saying something and not saying something.
Absolutely.
But I actually invoked Nuremberg principles that I think what they are implementing and designing is a mass fatality event.
Yeah.
That ethically and professionally, morally, I cannot go along with. I feel a moral obligation to dissent and oppose, and I'm never going to willingly withhold life-saving intervention from somebody.
For sure. Well, and to be fair, our code of ethics doesn't let us do that either.
I would lose my license, and I'm just not constitutionally capable of doing that.
Yeah.
And I don't know why they would want to impose that on an entire province.
Yeah.
And ask everybody to just withhold life-saving treatments, knowing that there's going to be, well, Sylvia Jones claims there's going to be no deaths, which shows just like how she's in a completely different reality than the rest of us. But there are going to be hundreds or thousands of predictable and preventable deaths as a result of this policy change, especially given the fact that this substitute that they've proposed is not implemented yet.
Well, and I think that one of my colleagues says it all the time, and I feel this a lot in my soul, is that people, like the general public, is going to be more upset with seeing more needles on the road than they are going to be seeing the bodies. Because I think when I talk to people all the time, it's all numbers, but these aren't numbers. These are human beings who have, the rights that we afford every other human being to their care. They have autonomy to make decisions about their care. They deserve ethical and safe care. They deserve all of the things that we afford any other health population. And they're trying to take that away.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We wouldn't do this to somebody with COPD. We wouldn't do this to somebody with diabetes. But because there's a moralistic connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
An old colleague of mine, when I was in street outreach, she was doing a master's, and the topic that she was exploring was this idea of grievable and non-grievable deaths. And
like disenfranchised grief? Or
well, obviously I can't speak to her research, but the idea that some deaths are grievable in the eyes of the general population.
I see, yeah.
Some are not grievable.
Okay, that makes sense, yeah. I get what you're saying.
I keep thinking of that.
Yeah.
I was thinking today so in a couple of contexts, in Toronto, there's the Barry and Honey Sherman deaths, which of course any death is terrible thing, like these mysterious circumstances that this couple died.
Yeah.
But that was 7 years ago, and there has probably been 100 articles in the Toronto Star about their deaths. And this almost cottage industry of true crime investigation that has surrounded their deaths. And I just can't help but think that the only reason for that is they're incredibly wealthy people. Whereas for those of us in our line of work, we experience endless death.
And we don't name them.
Yeah, and they don't even...
How do you, like, why do you know these two people's names, right? Sure, it's the media, but it's also not reported as, you know, body found at, you know, person died at, not suspicious, no homicide suspected, like those kinds of things, right? Like, that's the stigma, again, of faceless, nameless numbers versus humans.
Yeah, I can't help but think that we're, whether consciously or not, we're indexing the value of human life to socioeconomic status. And I think of the shooting at the supervised consumption site that led to these closures. It's like, is that implicit in this plan? Is it saying that that one person's death, who was middle or, middle class or upper class, because that person died, then thousands of marginalized people living in poverty must, their deaths can just passively happen?
It feels weird to have this conversation in such a nice part of town.
Yeah, we were just walking through some very nice houses.
Yeah.
But the class element to all of it.
Oh, 100%. No, it's...
It feels inescapable to me.
Yeah. Well, that's fair. Well, it's good you're doing this.
I hope.
Not only to kind of help re-enfranchise people whose voices need to be heard, and mine's not one of those, but your guest last week was just fantastic.
Roan.
Yeah, Roan was great. But also like to kind of help you heal from what you've experienced.
Hopefully by
or
extension
move forward.
Others.
Yeah. I guess heal is a strong word. Move forward, maybe.
Yeah, it's certainly like anybody who works in the field.
Yeah.
Nobody gets out unscathed.
Yeah.
It changes you, but it's like for me is the greatest honor of my life to work in that field and to serve the clients I served and to serve alongside the colleagues I did.
Yeah.
Do you have any closing thoughts on the topic or what you'd like people to hear?
Oh gosh. I don't know that I can summarize what we had our conversation about.
It doesn't have to summarize.
And also, again, like Roan last week, those are the voices that are so missing from this conversation.
Exactly.
But also, I think understanding again that like there are humans behind this, and those humans are both persons who are using these facilities and services, persons who are not and maybe should have access in some way, and then persons who are giving these services or giving themselves to these services, that are passionate about them, that are trying to make a difference for people and or just keep their head above water, because that's the best that they can do, because they're not getting what they need to be able to take care of themselves also. Like it's a collective group of people who have been stigmatized, whether that's the practitioners or whether that's the persons that consume the service, right?
Right, yeah.
And, dealing at this from a policy level is not, I mean, like, there is no perfect answer, right? We all know that it has to be individualized care, et cetera, but dealing from this just from a pure policy level and not understanding what's really happening on the ground, not living in it, not seeing in it, not working it, that's problematic, to say the very least.
Yeah, and I hope through this project I can at least give people the opportunity to have a better understanding of the nuance.
Yeah.
That people that like you, I know you said your voice is not important, but that I respectfully disagree. The level of understanding and nuance and like firsthand experience you have is so valuable, and it's easy to underestimate it from the inside. And I also agree that I really want to continue to welcome in people who use substances, who use the services, who are most directly impacted by these decisions.
Yeah. Because they're the ones that are silenced. I can get my voice heard. I'm very privileged.
Yeah.
You know,
But
and that's...
sharing your voice too, I think really does... I have the feeling that voices like yours offer a kind of fortress of protection in this audio format. There's no reason why the voices of service users, people who use the services, should be delegitimized, but we know they are.
Yeah.
And I think by having a kind of solidarity together, that we can amplify those voices, and it would be amazing if it led to actual policy changing and changing of hearts and minds.
Yeah.
That's a long process, but I think these are the first steps towards that. So thank you so much.
Anytime, my
I
pleasure.
had such a lovely walk. We walked all around Sherwood Park, along the streams, through the woods, and through this beautiful neighborhood on this beautiful Sunday, April 13th, 2025. Thank you so much, Lee.
Anytime.
Such a pleasure.
Hey Patrick, sorry, I'm super busy today, so I'm not going to be able to get to it. I think we've discussed the changes enough. I'm comfortable with you going ahead and posting it, and I'll try maybe to listen to it later. Also, I just wanted to let you know I just got an email. I'm privy to Toronto Drug Checking Services because of my job, and there was a new release put out just now saying, as a result of Ontario Community Care and Recovery Act, we've observed a 50% reduction in samples collected during the first 15 days of April as compared to the first 15 days of March. The closure of 5 supervised consumption sites where our drug checking services was offered has limited access to our program, preventing people from making informed decisions related to their substance use, as well as our ability to monitor the unregulated drug supply and share most timely and accessible information about what's circulating and anticipated harms. We are actively rebuilding our program, and thank you for our patience and ongoing support while we do so. This is exactly what I talked about in our interview about, like, I need that information to prepare our ERs. Like, holy smokes, hey?